Hey, everybody, welcome to our virtual Bible study. Thanks for tuning in. If you're following our current series in which we're talking about personal evangelism, this is going to be lesson number 3. So I encourage you, if you've not yet seen lesson number 1 and 2, you may want to go back and view those videos as well. It provides a little bit of context for what we're doing in our study. We've talked about, introductory in our introductory lesson about the reason why evangelism is so important. And we've talked about in lesson number 2 the intended audience of the Great Commission. It means everybody and what we can do about that. So we've tried to set the tone and pace for our study. And in this particular lesson, lesson number 3, is about motivation. And I think that's an important part of personal evangelism. I think it's an important part of why the church does what it does. If we're supposed to be out and about teaching the gospel to others, there's got to be a reason why we would do that, why be interested in people. And we're going to talk about that in this lesson number 3. Now, before we get into it specifically, I do want to remind you, if you're on our YouTube channel, to go below the video and hit the subscribe button. It's really super important for you. It means you don't miss content. For us, it means that you're helping boost our visibility on YouTube. And that's what we're really hoping that you'll help us to do, is boost our subscriptions. And of course, every time we post new content, please go on and check out the video and add to the number of views per video. That's how you gain traction on YouTube, and we hope that you'll help us to do that. I've said 1,000 times over, we are not a monetized channel. We don't get money for doing this. The Lord has a very scriptural way of gaining for the church, of having access to funds, and that's through a contribution on the first day of the week of, the faithful members come and they give as they've been prospered, and that's it. That's how we fund the work of the church. So we don't take up extra collections, and we don't make money off YouTube videos. We don't do that. So please enjoy, but help us out by sharing the videos and subscribing on YouTube. Now, on Facebook, it's a little bit different. We are a public page on Facebook, and we remain under the radar unless someone shares the video or shares a post, and then you like and follow the public page for North Hamilton, which means we need you to share the video on your timeline to help us to be visible to your friends who may not be familiar with us. And so you would help us out a great deal by doing that. So please, if you can, subscribe to our videos on YouTube. Please share the videos on Facebook. You help us out tremendously by doing that. Okay, so we're talking about personal evangelism. And in lesson number 3, we've titled this lesson, "He Was Moved with Compassion." Specifically, I want to look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, beginning through verse 38, and then we'll catch what happens down through verse 4 of chapter 10, because it's all connected. And to be fair, verse 5 and following is also connected to it, but really especially verses 1 through 4 of chapter 10. Okay, so I want to read the question that we'll be discussing in the class when we have live in-person class. I want to read that question, and then I want to read the passage, and then I'll give you some thoughts for that. So the question starts this way. It is, read Matthew 9:35 through verse 38. Why did the people come to Jesus? What was Jesus' principal concern? And how did Jesus address these concerns, verses 36 through Matthew chapter 10, verse 4? And what is the connection to evangelism? So what we're trying to find out is, what were his motives, and how do those motives convey into evangelism? Is there a connection to it? Okay, so verse 35. Let's just go ahead and read through verse 4 of chapter 10. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherds. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave to them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who's called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname is Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. So you have the listing of the 12. Okay, so what do we get out of that section? Okay, so first of all, in verse 35, notice there are three actions in verse 35. There was teaching in the synagogues, and this was very customary for Jesus, because obviously in a synagogue you had an available audience. I do think it's interesting that in the ministry of Paul, that Paul also followed the example of Jesus, and he taught in the synagogues as well. So he went to where there were people. Number two, he preached the gospel of the kingdom. Jesus had always been teaching something new. This was not a refurbished version of the Old Testament. He was teaching, I would say, was it Luke 16:16? That since John, he had taught, the kingdom, the principles of the kingdom, meaning so, up until John, there had been the Old Testament, and now something brand new is being revealed. So he's preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and he healed every sickness and every disease among the people. Now, the reason that happened was for the purpose of confirmation. In John 20, verses 30 and 31, the Bible tells us that there are a lot of unrecorded miracles that Jesus did, but the ones that are recorded for us are recorded so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing we might have life through his name. I mean, it means that miracles served a purpose of confirming the word. Mark 16, verses 17 through 20, the signs followed those people who were baptized believers, and they went everywhere confirming the word with signs following. Okay, so in the New Testament, we learn that miracles had a very specific purpose. They were to confirm divine revelation, to confirm divine truth. And Jesus used those. So here he is healing every sickness and every disease. Now, the longer his ministry continued, the longer it went on, the more that word spread, and the more that interest grew, and the crowd size increased tremendously. So, not that he ever had small crowds, but by the end, there were significantly more than the beginning. And a lot of that, in verse 35, a lot of people came to Jesus because they wanted to be healed. Some wanted to see miracles, and then there were plenty who had infirmities who came to Jesus because they wanted to be healed. And you can even see that back in verse 32. As they went out, behold, they brought to him a man mute and demon-possessed. And that seems to be pretty typical of where the Lord would go, that they would, in droves, come to Jesus in order to be healed. So there are a lot of people seeking physical healing. Amazingly, though, while they may come for physical healing, Jesus made sure they left with spiritual healing. Now, a great example of that would be Matthew chapter 9, earlier part of this chapter, in verses 1 through 8, where they bring to Jesus a paralyzed man, and they bring him on a cot. Remember, at the four corners, he's got four friends carrying him. They can't even get in the house because the house is so crowded. They go up to the top of the house. They remove some of the roof tiles, and they lower him through. And Jesus presents a lesson about forgiveness of sins. He also heals the man. But it was the case that when many came seeking Jesus for physical healing, they left with much greater spiritual healing. And I think that's going to be the case here too. It is the case here too. In verse 36, the Bible makes clear what Jesus was looking at when you had all these people brought to him. So you had a lot of folks that had, I mean, you can just imagine people laying everywhere, right? Crippled folk, the blind. I mean, they're just all over. And you walk up, and the first thing that we would see would be the physical infirmity. That man doesn't have a leg. Obviously, that man was born blind. He obviously can't talk. And we would see that. That is not what Jesus saw. Because look at verse 36. Verse 36, when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion. Why? Was he moved with compassion because they were infirmed? That's not what the text says. Yes, obviously Jesus he had pity on people in terrible conditions. You know, he was obviously touched by the feeling of their infirmities. But in verse 36, the Bible said he was moved with compassion upon them because they were weary, scattered, and they were like sheep having no shepherd. And the word weary here means to be harassed, as if you've been harassed, as in living under oppression. The word carries the sense of exhausted. They were exhausted. And the word means, the second word here is scattered. It means to be cast away with force. It's the word that means to throw to the ground. It is the word used to describe a man laid low with mortal wounds. And I always think here of the imagery. I always think of the parable Jesus told about a man that went from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And he fell among thieves. And they beat him up, and basically they left him. They thought they'd killed him. They left him for dead on the side of the road. That's the image I always have when I read about people that are scattered in this passage. They are beaten and bleeding and bruised, but not physically. It's spiritually that Jesus sees them in this condition. And then they were sheep having no shepherd. Obviously, they had no direction. It was the blind leading the blind. They were wandering, lost sheep. There was no stability in their life because the leaders weren't doing their job. And the key, I think, of verse 36 is to see the contrast between this and why they came. They came for physical healing. That's why they were there. They were following Jesus. Most of them wanted physical healing. And he sees souls in need of salvation. There's a huge contrast between the two of those. And one is vastly more important than the other, right? So we're not trying to demean physical infirmities. It's a terrible thing when the body doesn't work like it's supposed to, or in some way it's been harmed, either by birth, natural causes, disease, whatever it may be, or by accident, where somebody doesn't have the use of a limb, or can't see, or can't hear, or can't talk. It's a terrible thing. I feel so bad for anybody that would suffer any of those things, and Jesus even more, right? But that's not the most important thing about a person. The most important thing about a person is the soul and the condition of the soul. And Jesus looks at these folks, and he sees people who are lost spiritually, and they need help. That's what he sees. His motive was compassion. It says it right there in verse 36. He was moved with compassion, and the word means to be moved to the inward parts. And the reason for that is because the Greeks once considered the seat of a man to be his bowels. And so to speak of compassion means you're moved from inside out. From your core, you're moved. He yearned to help these people, but in the most important way. And observe, watch what happens. Look at what his conversation is beginning in verse 36. They're weary, scattered like sheep having no shepherd. And so he turns to the disciples, and what does he say? Let's get these folks to a hospital. Let me heal as many of them as I can. He didn't say that. He said, the harvest truly is plentiful, and the laborers are few. What's he concerned about? People getting the message to the lost in the world. Therefore, pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. He's concerned about people getting the message to the world, because that's how folks are saved, by the message. And then, of course, he appoints the 12, beginning in verse 1 through verse 4 of chapter 10. So his commission of the apostleship is directly tied to his love for lost souls. Now, this is for another lesson, but I think it's certainly important here too. Sometimes people have reservations about doing evangelism. They think you've got to have a PhD, and you have to have been to school for 16 years before you know what to say to a person. Jesus picked ordinary, common people to do his work. He picked fishermen and common laborers to take his message to the world, because the only thing that matters is loving people enough to share with them what God said, right? So it doesn't take extraordinary abilities to be a laborer in his vineyard. I think that's important. We'll get to that. We have a whole lesson on, am I capable of being an evangelist? And the answer is yes. Any of us are capable of doing that. But what's very important here, and I'm going to be very careful here, okay? Because I'll even clarify what I'm not talking about. There are many people who today believe, and many churches that believe, that our work in carrying out compassion to people is social outreach and community service. That's what they think the work of the church is. And so the focus exclusively in these congregations becomes feeding the hungry, or medical missions, or clothing drives, right? All these physical actions toward people who are in bad conditions. Now, is there anything inherently wrong in feeding the hungry? No. Is there anything wrong in providing food, or clothing rather, for people who need clothing? Certainly not. Is there anything wrong with providing medical treatment for infirmed people? No. Certainly not. There's nothing wrong with that. I want to be very clear that there's nothing wrong with that. And Jesus, in verse 35, healed every sickness and every disease. He did that. Okay? And then even when he appoints the apostles in chapter 10, verse 1, there's some physical things that come along with that. Power over unclean spirits to cast them out, heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. They had the ability to relieve physical needs. Okay? But the primary mission is not to relieve physical needs. It's to help souls by preaching truth. They were evangelists. That's what he appointed them to be. In fact, in chapter 10, verse 2, he appoints them as apostles. They're people sent with authority to do what? Well, if you drop down in verse 5 and following, to preach the gospel. He sent the 12 out. Don't go into the way of the Gentiles or into the city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and do what? And as you go, preach, saying. Their job was to preach the message. That's how souls are saved, by being convicted and converted through the message of truth. Can physical things go along with that, like feeding the hungry and clothing those who need clothing and healing as much as possible to the degree to which we could do that to relieve medical issues? Of course we can. Benevolence has always been a part of the work of evangelism. But the work of compassion is fulfilled by telling people what to do to go to heaven. That's so important. We do not show compassion on people if we do not spread the light of God's word in order to dispel darkness. It is truth that saves the soul. Feeding somebody won't save their soul. You'll fill their belly. That's a good thing. But it's not helping their soul, right? Now, it may be that we use that. We'll get to this later in another lesson. We use that as a door to open up the opportunity to speak to somebody about truth. You may have somebody open up their heart to hear the truth if we help clothe them. That can happen. But in and of itself, giving clothing to somebody and feeding the hungry is not evangelism. It's not evangelism. That's benevolence, but it's not evangelism. Evangelism is preaching the truth to people in the world, to teach them the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think the main thing to see in this is that Jesus' compassion was fulfilled in the preaching of the gospel. That's how he showed compassion to people. He taught them how to go to heaven. Okay, number two. Sorry about that. I usually record very early in the mornings, and so I'm just waking my voice up. And if I do it early enough in the week after I've had a weekend of preaching or anything like that, usually takes a little bit to wake my voice up. All right, number two. Do you think there is perhaps a disconnect between our beliefs and then the practical consequences of our beliefs. For example, do you believe that most members of the church are convicted of what happens in judgment and eternity? And if that's true, why do we not see the urgency to reach out to the lost with the gospel? What happens to people without salvation from sin, according to 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 8? So let's use the example of what happens at the end. Let's use the example of what the Lord tells us about what's coming one of these days. Could be any day. It's coming any of these days. Luke 16:19 through 31 talks about what happens in between now and judgment. Souls go, they're reserved in Hades for judgment. There's a side of paradise, there's a side of torment. You have in the story there illustrated the rich man who goes there. He laments his condition. He's in pain. He's very concerned about his 5 brothers on the earth who have not obeyed the Lord. He's lost. He knows he's lost. He can't change that because there's a great gulf fixed between them, and Abraham explains to him that he can't pass from one side to the other. On the other side is Lazarus, who, while he may have suffered in this life, he had good things in the next. He had reward, and he had rest, and there was reunion with all the faithful of ages past. But then we know that there's a day coming in which the Lord will return, not to this earth proper, right? He's not going to step foot on this earth because the earth is being destroyed. But in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18, that's going to commence with a shout from the Son of God, the voice of the archangel or an archangel, and the trumpet of God. And then there's going to be a resurrection from the grave. John 5:28 and 29, everybody that's in the grave is going to come out, righteous and unrighteous, and we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. Now in Matthew 25, there is a depiction of what happens at judgment. Down in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from the other, as the shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And then he's going to say to those in verse 41 on the left, "Depart from me." Then in verse 46, these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. There's going to be separation on Judgment Day. Those prepared, those saved, are going to go to heaven. Those unprepared, those not saved, are going to be lost eternally. Verse 46. Okay? So after judgment, there's heaven and hell. Those are two realities. In Romans 6:23, the Bible tells us the wages of sin is death. People are not lost because they have not heard the gospel. That's not why they're lost. They're lost because of sin. Sin is what makes people lost. And sin happens whether a person's ever been exposed to the gospel or not, because if they murder a man or they commit adultery or whatever they do, right, they lie, they steal, they curse, they profane, they worship God incorrectly, whatever they do, sin is sin. And when sin enters the life of a person, and it does by choice, we let it in, whether you've ever been exposed to the gospel or not, the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. Okay, now, 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 8. I mentioned that passage. Turn your Bible there with me. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 8. I get riled up about that because I hear people say people are only lost because they haven't heard the gospel. Then don't ever go preach to them. The worst thing you could ever do would be to preach to them, because you make them lost by preaching the truth. That's what a terrible thing to believe, that somehow truth makes people lost because they've been exposed to it. People are not lost because of lack of exposure to the gospel. People are lost because of sin. Sin is what destroys people. Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death. Now watch this. What happens to people who have not obeyed the gospel at judgment? 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 8. In flaming fire, taking vengeance on two groups. Number one, those who do not know God. These are people who don't have a relationship with him. And knowing here would be by experience, right? They don't have fellowship with him. People who do not have fellowship with God. And number two, those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. They don't obey it. That could include people who obey it and fall away from it and don't keep on obeying it. But the idea would be they don't know God, they don't have fellowship with him, they don't understand him, they don't know him, and they don't obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay? So in judgment, all these people we know, friends, family members, co-workers, who have never obeyed the gospel and do not know God, what's going to happen to those folks on Judgment Day? And that's not your folks, that's my folks too. I have family who fit that category. I have dear friends who fall into that category. Associates in life. I think the world of these people. They fall into that category. They don't know God and they have not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. What will happen to them on the day of judgment? They will be lost. And they'll be lost forever. Should that not affect our urgency? Should it not affect the way that we interact with people? If we truly have compassion for lost souls, if we say we dearly love these lost people, if we love them, then we must and we should share the gospel with them. We cannot be satisfied that people will stand in judgment and be lost. That's why Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it's day. The night is coming when no man can work. There's a time to rest, but now's not it. Right? There's too much to do. There's too many people to reach. And I could preach at this point. This is to me and to everybody. But when we withdraw, and our most important priorities are my house, my cars, my vacations, my recreation, and there are billions of people lost and dying in this world who will be lost in judgment. That is not good enough. Okay? I could get riled up about that. Jesus had compassion for people, and you know what he did? He commissioned evangelism efforts because he wants those people to go to heaven. And it's not enough for us to look at lost people in the world and say, it's so sad that they're lost, and then do nothing about it. That's not compassion. Compassion is to be moved from within the very depths of us to do something about people. No, we've got a lot to talk about because people, we make our excuses. Well, I'm introverted and I don't like to talk to people and all those things. We've got to do something. Okay? We're going to try to find out in the course of our study what it is that we can do, because it's not enough to look at a world full of lost people and say, that's so sad. Jesus was moved with compassion. He taught them. He set up apostles who would teach them. He expects us to do the same. All right. I got to get off this point or I'm going to keep on preaching. Question number 3, and we're almost out of time. Okay. Question number 3. Why do you think that we aren't spreading the message like we should spread it? What are some causes of our inactivity? And do you think that fear is one of those? Do you think cowardice is one of those? Or terror, fear? Especially when it comes to our friends and family. What does Jesus teach us in Matthew 10, verses 32 through 39? And what should be our first love? And how would this help us to be more active in evangelism? So why aren't we active? Why aren't we? So I just jotted down a bunch of things in the live in-person class when we go through this. I can't wait. I love on points like these. I love hearing what people have to say because people always think of something that I didn't think of. But I'm going to tell you my thinks on this. Apathy. In truth, sometimes we just don't care. We're too busy. We're too busy. We're preoccupied. We don't have time to talk to people. We don't. There's no chance to build relationships when our lives are so full of self-satisfaction. Just don't have time for people. A lack of understanding. I mean, that could be it. Maybe it is, there's some people who probably would do it. They just don't understand that's their job. So maybe that's it. A shift in focus of the local church, right? This goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago. There's been a shift in the focus of local congregations. They become very physical and not so spiritual. They love to meet physical needs because you can do that all day long and you don't have to talk to somebody about the gospel. You can hand somebody a bag full of clothing and they walk out the door and pat you on the back and say, thank you, you're really nice, and we feel good about that. But there's been no confrontation of their sin, right? So a shift in the focus of the local church. Maybe it is we aren't convinced people are lost. We say, well, they're good people, but the wages of sin is death. That's true. That's not going to change. That's what the Bible says. I think there are today very few role models for evangelism. Usually we're involved in things where we see people doing it and they motivate us to do it. There's not a lot of that going on. We're isolated from the world. And we'll talk about this in another lesson, but this is a pet peeve. I've tried to personally be better about this. Yes, we're supposed to be sanctified and consecrated. We're not supposed to be like the world, but we are supposed to be in the world. Not doing bad things, not putting ourselves in bad situations, but we're supposed to be around lost people. Now, that doesn't mean you compromise and you go hang out every Friday night. You go to the Double D honky tonk and you hang out, you line dance and drink beer with people all night long because you just be one of the people so they'll know that you're one of them. That's not what that means. The Bible tells us to run from evil and avoid the very appearance of evil. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22. Okay, so I'm not saying that, but you've got to be around lost people. I've got to be around lost people. Can't sit in an office, can't sit behind the four walls of a church building and expect to convert the world. We've got to be out among them, establishing relationships. Some believe evangelism is too hard. People believe that, say, well, I can't do it, it's too hard. Or we get discouraged, right? Maybe we've tried in the past, we've been told no. It's hard to be told no when you try to be evangelistic. And when you have the lack of immediate results, because we've been conditioned by our culture to expect immediate results. When you don't get them, it's very difficult. We feel we're very unqualified for the task, which is interesting because Jesus appointed fishermen to do that. So if they can, you can, I can. But another is fear, and I asked that in the question. I can't wait to talk about this in the live in-person class. I hope you'll come and be part of that. And I know if you wait to see this airs the same time as the class, but please come and be part of our in-person classes because you get so much more out of that. But fear is a paralyzing attitude. We are so afraid we're going to offend somebody. We are petrified we're going to hurt somebody's feelings, especially if they're a family member, and they won't talk to us anymore. We won't be able to go have Christmas dinner anymore because they're going to be so mad at us. So we'd rather be silent and let them be lost in sin than say something. We're afraid we'll be rejected. We are sometimes afraid we'll be ridiculed. You don't dare want to say something to a coworker. They'll spread it around, and all of a sudden you'll be the subject of every joke in the break room. And that's why we don't do it. We're so afraid, and we're more afraid of the reaction of people than we are of what's going to happen to them at judgment. And we're especially afraid of those closest to us. We don't want to offend our family members and our friends. We don't want separation. I want to end by just reading what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, because he talks about what our priority should be. And listen, this is not arbitrary. It's not saying, go be mean to your family members. You shouldn't be mean, period. But we ought to have compassion and love them enough that if they've got a terrible disease and they've got sin's the worst kind of disease you can have, that we want to offer the cure to them. Hey, you come to church? Can I send you a Bible study? Let me read Matthew 10, verse 32 beginning. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. Now, this is not talking about the confession as a part of becoming a Christian. This is about daily confession. The idea would be, if you keep on doing this here on this earth, then I'm going to do this before my Father in heaven. Verse 33, whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who's in heaven. That's talking about judgment and what happens beyond. Verse 34, here's how that looks. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And this is not saying, again, be unkind and be mean. But listen to what he's saying. I've come to set a man at variance or against a father, and a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. Father, mother, sister, brother, things of that sort. He who loves father or mother more than me, Jesus says, is not worthy of me. What's this about? Loving Jesus more, loving him more than we love our family members. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. This is about priorities. He who does not take his cross and follow after me, it's not easy to bear a cross. Never said it would be. That's why he came to bring a sword, not peace. He who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it. That is, if you seek to satisfy yourself. And included in that would be, well, it's more beneficial for my life here if I get along with my family versus them being mad at me for trying to teach them the truth. You're going to lose your life in the end. That's what he said. And he who loses his life, in other words, you lose your life in Christ. You bury it inside Christ so that it's him living through you for my sake will find it. Okay, so again, it's not about being unkind. It's about loving people. If you say, I love my mama more than anything in the world, then what should be your number one goal for your mama? To get her to heaven. Because you are not doing your mama any favors, and I'm not doing my mama any favors. If she's lost in sin, if I just let her be lost in sin without trying to pull her out of that with the truth of God. That's what today's lesson was all about. So lesson number 3 is about loving people enough to do what is in their best interest. That's what real love is. Real love is doing what is in the best interest of another person. That's what Jesus did. He had compassion for lost people. When he saw people, what he saw most was their soul and the condition of their soul. And I've got to be strong enough to do that for my mom and dad and for my wife and for my kids, that when I see them, I've got to remember these are souls that are going to stand in judgment. And where are they going? And I want to do what I can to make sure that they end up in heaven someday. And I'll do whatever I can to get them there. I'm going to give them truth. That's what this lesson is about. All right. That's an important part of evangelism. Can't get away from it. All right. Lesson number 4 coming up next. Stay tuned. Until then, please know I love you. God loves you even more than I do. I appreciate you so much, more than you can imagine. I appreciate you. And just hang in there. If I can answer questions, let me know. I'll be glad to do it. See you next time. Bye.